All right, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a fascinating area of thought, a place where philosophy and psychology aren't just neighbors, but truly intertwined.
Yeah, it's a field that takes those really big, enduring philosophical questions,
Mhm.
the ones about minds, morals, knowledge that people have argued about for ages, and, well, it gives them a different kind of treatment.
It asks, what happens if we stop just thinking about these concepts from our armchairs
Right.
and actually start testing them?
Exactly. We're talking about experimental philosophy, sometimes called X-Phi, and we're specifically looking at work linked to a major figure, Joshua Knobe.
So instead of relying purely on like introspection or what philosophers think people's intuitions should be, X-Fi uses methods from science.
Right, empirical methods, think surveys, experiments, often with just ordinary people to see how these concepts actually work in the wild, so to speak.
And the sources we're digging into for this deep dive.
They're mostly academic texts, volumes from the Experimental Philosophy series. Knobe edited some with Sean Nichols and other books from Oxford Studies in Experimental Philosophy. It's really about getting hard data on these, well, sometimes squishy-seeming philosophical ideas.
Okay, so our mission today is to explore the key themes coming out of this work, understand why it matters for philosophy, and for us, maybe look at some surprising real-world uses,
Yeah.
and hopefully prompt some thoughtful questions for you about your own thinking.
Think of it like taking philosophy out of the seminar room and, I don't know, maybe into the lab, or at least using lab methods to get objective data on things philosophers traditionally thought were only accessible through reflection.
The core idea being that if you make a claim about a shared human intuition, say about what knowledge means to people.
Then that's actually an empirical prediction. It's something you can, in principle, test.
So if a philosopher argues, based on their analysis, that our concept of knowledge has to work a certain way,
An experimental philosopher comes along and says, okay, interesting hypothesis. Let's design a study and see if that's really how people use the term.
it's a movement using psychology and cognitive science methods to test philosophical claims. Claims that traditionally came just from thinking about them, right? Conceptual analysis.
Precisely. They're not necessarily saying conceptual analysis is bad, but that claims about shared concepts or common intuitions need some empirical backup. You can't just assume everyone's intuition matches the philosophers.
And this approach, it's led to some findings that really make you pause.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe the most famous one, definitely strongly linked to Joshua Knobe's early work, is what people call the side effect, or just the Knobe effect.
Okay, this is where it gets really counterintuitive, I think. It's about how we judge if someone did something intentionally.
Right. The core idea, basically, is that our judgments about whether an action was done intentionally seem to be influenced by how morally good or bad the outcome is.
Even if the outcome was just a foreseen side effect, something the person knew would happen but didn't actually want to happen.
Exactly that. Even then.
Okay, walk us through the classic example from the sources, the CEO one.
Sure. So imagine a CEO is deciding whether to launch a new program. He knows it will definitely increase profits, that's his main goal, but he also knows it will definitely harm the environment as a side effect.
Okay, goal, profit, known side effect, harm.
And the CEO explicitly says, look, I don't care at all about harming the environment. I just want to make as much profit as I can.
So he sees the harm coming, but it's not his goal. He's indifferent to it.
Indifferent, exactly. Now, when you ask people in studies, did the CEO intentionally harm the environment? A huge majority, like 80-something% in one study, say yes.
Okay, on its own, maybe that feels kind of right.
Yeah.
But the kicker is the comparison, isn't it?
That's the crucial part. You run almost the exact same scenario, but you flip the side effect. Now the program will increase profits and it will help the environment.
Same goal, same indifference from the CEO.
Right, the CEO still says, I don't care at all about helping the environment. I just want profit.
Foreseen, not desired, but this time it's a good side effect.
Correct. And now when you ask people, did the CEO intentionally help the environment? The number saying yes plummets, like down to maybe 20-something%.
Wow. Okay, so the CEO's mental state regarding the side effect, knew it would happen, didn't care either way, is identical in both stories.
Identical.
But people are way more likely to call the side effect intentional when it's bad than when it's good.
That's the Knobe effect in a nutshell. It's this asymmetry. And it really challenges those traditional philosophical accounts of intentional action, the ones that focus purely on, say, Desire, belief, foresight, maybe skill.
Because those factors are the same in both versions of the story.
Exactly. It strongly suggests that our moral evaluation of the outcome is somehow bleeding into, or maybe it's part of, how we apply the very concept of intentionality.
And you can immediately see how that could have big implications, like in the legal world.
Oh, absolutely. Think about criminal law, especially the idea of mens rea sed, the guilty mind requirement. You need a certain mental state, often intent, for many crimes.
Right.
But if a juror's judgment about whether a defendant acted intentionally can be swayed by how bad the outcome was, even if the defendant's main goal was something else entirely, well, that raises real questions about fairness, doesn't it?
Yeah, it suggests jurors might be more likely to find intent just because the result was harmful, even if, by a strict legal definition focusing only on desire and foresight, it wasn't the primary intention.
It points to a potential gap between the formal legal definitions and how people intuitively use these concepts, with morality playing this unexpected role.
Fascinating. Okay, so that's intentional action. What about morality itself? Does X-Phi look at how people think about moral truth?
It does, big time. So one area is looking at whether ordinary people, the folk, as they often say in these studies, lean towards moral objectivism or subjectivism.
Like, do people think stealing is wrong, is a fact, like the earth is round, or more like an opinion, like broccoli tastes bad?
Kind of, yeah. It's about whether moral judgments are seen as true or false independently of what anyone thinks, or if they're relative to individuals or cultures.
And how do they test that? You can't just ask people, are you a moral objectivist?
Right, that probably wouldn't work well. They often use something called a disagreement paradigm. They'll present participants with scenarios where two people disagree about something.
Okay.
Maybe a factual disagreement, is Paris the capital of France?
Huh.
An ethical one, is it okay to lie to protect someone's feelings? Maybe one about social convention, should you wear shoes indoors? Or just taste, is this band good?
Different kinds of disagreements.
And then they ask, essentially, could both people be right, or does at least one of them have to be mistaken?
Ah, I see. If you think only one can be right, that suggests you see it as more objective.
Exactly. And the findings? Well, it seems people generally treat moral disagreements as more objective than disagreements about taste or convention. They're more likely to say someone must be wrong in a moral dispute.
Okay, so not purely subjective like taste.
But they also tend to treat moral disagreements as less objective than factual disagreements. So it's not like they see stealing is wrong as having the exact same kind of truth as 2 + 2 = 4.
It's somewhere in between.
It often looks like that. Folk morality seems to occupy this middle ground, and other factors can play a role too. Some studies find that religious belief, for instance, correlates with seeing morality as more objective.
Interesting.
And there's even research looking into nuances like folk indexical moral relativism, this idea that maybe the truth of a moral claim depends on context or perspective in some way. People might sometimes say neither person in a moral argument is wrong, but then also say one person doesn't have a good reason for their belief, which kind of hints at some standard being applied.
Huh. So our everyday views on this stuff might be pretty complex, maybe even a bit messy or contradictory.
It certainly seems that way. It's not a simple picture.
What about something really fundamental, like how do we even decide if something has a mind? Or what kind of mind it has?
Yeah, mind perception is another big area. How do we attribute mental states like consciousness, feelings, planning abilities, agency to other humans, animals, maybe even robots or, corporations?
Like, do people think a sophisticated AI can feel pain? Or does a fish have intentions?
Exactly those kinds of questions. And some key research discussed in the sources suggests we tend to perceive minds along 2 main dimensions.
2 dimensions. Okay, what are they?
They're often called agency and experience. Agency is about the capacity to do things, to plan, act intentionally, exert self-control. Experience is about the capacity to feel things, sensations, emotions, consciousness.
Okay, doing versus feeling, roughly.
Roughly, yeah. And the interesting finding is that people seem to be able to separate these two in their judgments about different beings.
They don't always go together.
Not necessarily. Think about common perceptions. Maybe God is seen as very high on agency, planning, acting, but perhaps lower on experience. Does God feel pain or pleasure in the human sense?
Okay, I see.
Or maybe a frog, or even a human baby, might be seen as high on experience, feeling pain, basic sensations, but lower on agency, complex planning.
Right, that maps onto intuition quite well. You can have one without the other, or different levels.
And studies with robots explore this too. They found people were often more willing to attribute mental states that lack valence states that aren't inherently good or bad, like seeing red or calculating a sum.
Neutral processing states.
Right. They were more willing to attribute those to robots than states with valence, positive or negative ones, like feeling happy or being angry or suffering pain.
So it's harder for us to imagine a machine having subjective feelings, especially emotional ones, than just processing information neutrally.
The data points that way. It suggests that this positive-negative aspect, the valence, might be really central to our ordinary concept of what subjective experience is.
And this kind of empirical work on how people actually think about minds and experience,
Yeah.
how does that connect back to philosophy?
Well, it can potentially challenge philosophical theories, especially around consciousness, things like phenomenal consciousness or the hard problem.
How so?
If philosophers are building complex theories based on a particular understanding of consciousness or subjective experience, but experimental work shows that ordinary people's concept is structured differently or emphasizes different aspects like valence.
Then it raises the question of whether the philosophers are analyzing the same concept that's actually being used in everyday life and language.
Exactly. It puts empirical pressure on those philosophical assumptions. Are you analyzing a common human concept or a more specialized, perhaps theoretically loaded one?
Okay, got it. That makes sense. What about causation and responsibility? That feels linked to the intentionality stuff.
It definitely is linked, but it's broader too. This research looks into how we assign causes to events and how we attribute responsibility, and importantly, how those two judgments might influence each other.
Influence each other.
Well, one hypothesis discussed in the sources is a kind of motivated reasoning or motivational bias. The idea is that if we think someone deserves blame for a bad outcome,
Or desire to blame them.
might actually make us more likely to judge their action as the primary cause of the outcome, maybe downplaying other contributing factors.
Oh. So my moral judgment could actually shift my perception of the causal facts.
That's the controversial but fascinating suggestion from some studies. And it's not just about blame. Judgments about causation can also be influenced by whether an action violates a norm.
A social norm. Or a rule.
Yeah. Take the example of a doctor who deviates from the standard procedure. Even if the patient ends up doing just fine, maybe even better.
Okay.
The fact that the doctor broke the norm might lead people to see the doctor's action as the cause of the outcome more strongly than if they had followed the standard procedure, even if the causal path was basically equivalent.
So our judgment of cause isn't just about physics or the chain of events. It's sensitive to norms, too. That's really interesting.
Right.
It suggests our everyday concept of causation is much richer, maybe more socially embedded than purely mechanical models might capture.
And responsibility, how does that get dissected?
Researchers look at factors influencing responsibility judgments, like pivotality, basically. How close someone was to being the deciding factor for an outcome, or criticality, how important their contribution seemed. They also look at the difference between actions and omissions, letting something happen versus doing it.
And the classic philosophical issue. Could the person have done otherwise? Does that matter to people?
That's a huge one. Philosophers have this thing called the principle of alternative possibilities, or PA, which generally says you can only be morally responsible if you could have chosen differently.
Makes sense, right? If you had no choice, how can you be blamed?
Seems intuitive, but some experimental findings actually challenge this, at least in terms of how people make judgments. Studies suggest people sometimes do attribute moral responsibility, even in situations where it seems the outcome was unavoidable or the agent really couldn't have done otherwise.
Really? So our gut feeling about responsibility might be tougher, or maybe just different, than that philosophical principle suggests.
It might be. Judgments about blame in those unavoidable situations can get quite complex and depend on various factors, but the simple PAPI-P principle doesn't always seem to capture folk intuition perfectly.
Okay, what about something seemingly simpler, like happiness? Surely that's just about feeling good.
You'd think. But even there, X-Phi studies suggest the folk concept isn't purely descriptive. It's not just about reporting your internal state, like pleasure or life satisfaction.
No, what else is there?
The sources suggest it's also evaluative.
Evaluative meaning?
Meaning it includes a kind of judgment. It's not just are you feeling positive states, but also, in a sense, should you be? Is the happiness connected to living a life that's considered morally or normatively good?
So if someone reports feeling immense pleasure while doing something terrible,
Other people might hesitate to say that person is truly happy. Even if the person feels subjectively good, the folk concept of happiness might involve this extra layer of judging whether the feelings are, well, appropriate or well-founded in a good life.
Right, like there's feeling good and then there's real happiness, which involves more than just subjective state that actually resonates. What about the flip side? Negative concepts like prejudice.
Yeah, that's another area. Traditionally, work on dehumanization focused on how targets of prejudice, the victims, are seen as less than human.
Right.
But some newer X-Phi work looks at the perpetrators of prejudice, like how do we perceive racists or sexists?
Do people dehumanize the perpetrators too?
Sometimes, yes. And the interesting finding mentioned in the sources is that dehumanizing prejudiced people seems to correlate with being more willing to see bias, like racial or sexist bias, in situations that are ambiguous.
Wait, that seems backwards. You have to dehumanize a racist. Why would that make you better at spotting racism?
It seems counterintuitive, I know, but it connects to another line of research on the concept of the true self.
The true self.
Yeah, this common intuition people seem to have that everyone, including themselves, has a deep down, fundamentally good core self.
Oh, okay.
So the idea is, if you see someone as fully human, possessing this good, true self, you might be hesitant to attribute really negative traits like deep-seated racism to them. It conflicts with the good core idea.
You want to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe?
Something like that. But if you've already dehumanized the person, perhaps because of their expressed prejudice, that barrier, the assumption of a good, true self, might be lowered. And so you might be quicker or more willing to interpret their ambiguous actions as stemming from bias.
Wow, okay. That's a complex loop.
Yeah.
Our perception of someone's basic humanity affects our willingness to attribute negative moral traits, which in turn affects how we interpret their actions.
It's definitely thought-provoking. And this also connects to how language might shape our thinking, particularly through generic statements.
Generics, like saying ducks swim or lions are dangerous.
Exactly. Or generics about social groups. Boys like blue, lawyers are argumentative, things like that. Studies suggest that hearing these kinds of statements, especially when you're young, can lead people to infer that the group members share some kind of deep, underlying, maybe unobservable property or essence.
Even if the statement is just about a typical tendency, not something true of every single member, or something that's fixed.
Right. Hearing Zarpies are creative might subtly lead you to think there's something essentially creative about being a Zarpie, making them creative, rather than just observing a common trait.
It implies an is from an are often.
Precisely put. And this can contribute to social essentialism thinking groups have fixed essences, which can be a pathway towards stereotyping and prejudice. It links typicality, maybe fixity, maybe even purpose in our minds, even if those links aren't logically sound.
Okay, so experimental philosophy uses these empirical methods, these vignettes and surveys, to uncover all these surprising complexities and influences on our concepts. But what about the methods themselves? Are they foolproof?
Oh, definitely not foolproof. The sources are quite clear about methodological challenges. Relying heavily on these hypothetical cases, the vignettes, is powerful, but it has limits.
Like, how do you know if people are really thinking deeply or just giving a quick answer?
Exactly. That's a major concern. Are these surveys capturing stable, robust intuitions or just surface intuitions that might change depending on how you word the question or the context you provide?
Seems tricky to control for that.
It is. Some researchers propose alternatives, like a dialogue model instead of just a simple survey model. The idea is maybe you need more interaction, allowing people to reflect, maybe challenge their initial response to get at more considered judgments, kind of like a mini philosophical dialogue.
Makes sense. What other potential pitfalls are there?
Well, there are standard survey issues. People not paying close attention, rushing through insufficient effort responding. There are order effects. Answering one question might influence how you answer the next one. People might interpret the scenarios differently based on pragmatic cues, not just the literal words. And simple competence or performance failures, someone just misunderstands what's being asked.
Yeah, humans are messy research subjects.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
And you also find variation. Sometimes intuitions differ across demographic groups. Gender differences pop up in some studies. Or you might see differences, or sometimes surprisingly no difference, between laypeople and experts like philosophers or lawyers on certain philosophical questions.
Which then raises that tricky philosophical question. Whose intuition counts most? The person on the streets. The experts. Does it matter?
That's a huge debate sparked by X-Phi. And underlying all of this is the big interpretation challenge. When you find that people use a concept in a certain way, say, linking intentionality to moral judgment, what have you actually discovered? Have you learned something fundamental about the concept of intentionality itself, a philosophical claim? Or have you primarily learned something about the psychological processes people use when applying that concept, a psychological claim?
The difference between the concept itself and how our brains happen to deploy it. That's a subtle but crucial distinction.
It really is. And that's a central point of discussion and sometimes disagreement within the field and between experimental and traditional philosophers.
Okay, so despite these methodological debates and interpretive challenges, what's the bigger picture? What's the significance of all this work? How is it actually used outside of niche academic journals?
Well, for cognitive science and psychology, it's incredibly valuable. It provides real empirical data on how human minds actually process these fundamental concepts about minds, morals, causes, and so on. It helps build and test psychological theories.
It gives psychology concrete data to work with on abstract concepts.
Right. And for philosophy itself, it's been, well, arguably transformative. It directly feeds into, and often challenges, traditional philosophical theories by checking their assumptions about common sense or folk intuition against reality.
Like the Knobe Effect, challenging theories of intent.
Exactly. Findings like that don't just describe, they put pressure on theories that don't align with how people actually use the concepts. It can force philosophical debates onto new, more empirically informed ground.
It helps keep philosophy tethered to, how humans actually think, maybe.
That's one way to put it, yeah. It also offers really deep insights for just understanding ourselves and society better. The work on moral cognition, mind perception, blame attribution, it sheds light on things like implicit bias, how we perceive other groups, why disagreements get so heated, how abstract ideas like agency or essentialism shape our social world.
Understanding why people disagree about morality, for instance, seems pretty relevant.
Hugely relevant. And in public discourse generally, think about it. Concepts like intention, cause, responsibility, fairness are thrown around constantly in political debates, news reports, everyday arguments. Understanding the underlying psychology, the folk theories people bring to these concepts, like the different ways people might think about moral objectivity, can help us understand why communication breaks down, why people seem to talk past each other, or how certain ways of talking, like using generics, might subtly reinforce problematic beliefs or prejudices.
So it can help diagnose some of the hidden psychological machinery behind social and political friction?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And maybe most importantly for you listening, it kind of encourages a critical look inwards. It prompts you to think about the source and reliability of your own intuitions.
When you had that gut reaction to the CEO case, why did you have it?
Exactly. Was it purely logic? Or were other factors, maybe moral feelings, subtly shaping your judgment without you realizing it? It encourages that kind of valuable self-reflection, that metacognition about our own thinking processes.
Okay, so drawing this all together then, this deep dive into Knobe's work, into experimental philosophy, what's the main takeaway?
I think it's that our everyday understanding of concepts we use all the time, concepts that seem simple on the surface, intention, knowledge, cause, happiness, even self, is actually incredibly complex, surprisingly nuanced.
They're not these neat little boxes we just apply logically.
Not at all. They seem deeply interconnected with other parts of our minds, our moral judgments or social context, the specific way things are presented to us, these underlying cognitive mechanisms.
And it forces us to confront how actual human thinking sometimes diverges from the cleaner, maybe more idealized pictures painted by some traditional philosophical theories.
Right, and that gap, that divergence, is itself a really rich area for more research, both psychological and philosophical. Where do folk concepts and philosophical analyses align, and where do they differ, and why?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's go back to the Knobe effect, the side effect, one last time. If something as seemingly straightforward as judging whether an action was intentional can be unconsciously swayed by our moral take on the outcome, how might that kind of subtle influence be operating elsewhere, in the much bigger, messier judgments we make every day?
You mean about politics, people's characters, news events?
Yeah. If our moral compass can subtly bend our perception of a simple fact like intent, what else is it bending? How much of what we perceive as objective reality might actually be shaded by our values, our norms, our biases in ways we just don't notice?
It suggests our grasp on reality might be more intertwined with our evaluations than we typically assume.
So here's the question for you to mull over. Think about your own everyday judgments. Judgments about fairness, about what's true, who's to blame for something, what makes one a good person or a bad one, maybe even your own happiness. What subtle hidden factors based on how your concepts are structured, how your mind works, might be influencing those judgments without you even being aware of it.
It's a fascinating, maybe slightly unsettling question about the architecture of our own minds.
Definitely something to ponder long after this deep dive is over.